Hello, and welcome to AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. I'm your host, John S. Today we'll be speaking with Jerry F. from Phoenix, Arizona. In this episode, Jerry talks about how he discovered changes that were made to the first 164 pages of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, and what he did about it. I think you'll enjoy this very interesting conversation. Hey, Jerry. How you doing?
Hi, John. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to have you here again. You know, you were the very first person that I ever did a podcast with.
Is that right? I was the guinea pig, huh?
You were. Okay. I've learned a lot since then. So hopefully, this will be a good one for you. So anyway, the reason we're talking today is you had a really interesting experience with the big book. You were, and I noticed this little line too. I think it was in the third edition on a certain page. It says that they said something like, in the first printing of this publication, such and such. And you were always told that, hey, nothing has ever changed in the big book. So when you saw that they were talking about something being different in the first edition, it kind of caught your attention and you looked into it, and what you found out was pretty interesting, I thought.
Yes, what I did actually was on page 114 in the third or the fourth edition. And it says in there's a sentence, it says, since this book was first published, AA has released thousands of alcoholics from asylums and hospitals of every kind. The majority have never returned. The power of God goes deep. And I put, since it was a textbook, I don't mark other books, but textbooks I do, and so I put in the margin, what the hell? I've been told, even by my sponsor, that the first 164 pages have never been changed. And you can hear that in meetings today, that there's never been a change. And so I made a little marginal note to check it out. Well, it was a long time. I waited until I retired. And basically what I did then, meanwhile I had become aware online and other places of this change and that change, that the 12th step had been changed, that the third pertinent idea had been changed twice. And these were just comments that I was collecting. And so finally I sat down and with the first edition and with the second edition, and just started to compare them page by page. And at first, I was disregarding punctuation, grammar, anything of that sort. It's unimportant. Who cares? And just looking for the big changes, as it were, the really meaningful ones. And then I got, I don't know, maybe a chapter into it and realized, and I began to see, for example, the word power was capitalized in one place and not in another. Well, that changes the meaning entirely of that word.
Totally.
And of the concept that whole section is dealing with. And so I had to scrap my work and go back. Mm-hmm. And this is what I did for, I believe it was about 6 weeks. I would get up in the morning, fix my pot of coffee, go into my office, and spend the entire day with those two books side by side, making notes. And the vast majority of which were punctuation. And so it was tedious work. It was not enjoyable in any way. But there were some interesting changes, too. And I began to record all of them. And what I reached was 401 changes.
Wow.
Yes. And so that in itself is significant. So,
what were some of the more interesting changes that you found?
Well, see, there's, John, the most difficult part of the project really was not allowing myself to deal with that. If I made a value judgment that this was meaningful and this other one was just incidental, then I would reject a change. And I decided not to ask myself that question. Don't put any value judgment on it. The interesting ones, uninteresting to me or to you, might be different. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to go head for a count. And so that's the question I didn't allow myself to ask. But of course, since then, and even during then, though I didn't make any note of it, I saw some interesting changes that we would consider interesting. For example, because of our secularity, especially. And this is odd. The word in chapter 7, the word fellowship, is in lowercase. And in the change to the second edition, the F in fellowship was capitalized. So that's an emphasization of the fellowship. And of course, I'm all for that, as many of us believe that it is the fellowship rather than some deity that is working on us. But at the same time, in chapter 11, 4 times the word fellowship occurs, and in the first edition, it was always capitalized. In the second edition, it was in lowercase. And so that's a de-emphasization of the fellowship. And then also in chapter 11, the word fellow.
That's interesting. So after the first edition, it was de-emphasized.
It was de-emphasized in chapter 11. It was emphasized in chapter 7. So if you're looking for an agenda, who did what and why kind of a thing, it's very difficult. Also in chapter 11, the word fellow, it says fellow of Alcoholics Anonymous twice, and that was capitalized in the first edition and in lowercase in the second edition. So, I begin to speculate, well, okay, so what if we had, say, 2 people or 3 or whatever working on this project, and they don't communicate with each other? One has feelings one way and one the other way. I don't know. It's really hard to draw any conclusions that you can really feel comfortable with on the entire 164 pages. Although in various chapters you can get an idea of what the changes were all about.
I don't know if you've ever been to one of these hardcore big book study groups, but there's one here in Kansas City that is just totally crazy about the big book. But they actually pay attention to all these little things, like what word is capitalized and what it means because it's capitalized and all of this. So I bet that they would be very surprised to learn that changes were made of those first 164 pages, because I think a lot of people assume that there wasn't any changes.
Right. No, I have not had that opportunity. In fact, when I was doing this, I was interested in starting a big book study, but a real big book study, not just read and start talking about what happened with you and your boss that day. But but actually studying the big book with other people, because that I felt I could get from additional information, different additional input from people with different opinions. But I was unable to really start in this area at any rate. No one seemed to be interested in actually understanding why Bill wrote this instead of that, and how one chapter seemed to differ so much. At the time, I took an instant dislike to the chapter to employers, because nothing to do with the subject matter, but it's just pure English comp. It's poorly written. He starts out with an idea and he makes a point, and then he goes on to another paragraph, and then he's back at that first point. Now that can be a device. He could be re-emphasizing something. I understand that that's something that writers do, but that wasn't the case here. It was just the fact that the guy was writing like stream of consciousness almost. I mean, it was not outlined. It was very poorly done. And
I remember reading somewhere that Hank Parkhurst wanted to write that chapter. Do you recall that?
Yes, I didn't know it at the time, but I do know now. I mean, among AA historians, especially the ones that I have some respect for, there's no doubt in their minds that Hank Parkhurst wrote that chapter to employers.
So he did write it. Okay.
Yeah, and so no wonder it was jumped out so different. I also didn't like Two Lives, almost as bad, and also for compositional reasons, although there's no question that Bill wrote that one. So but most
he missed an opportunity there. Had he let Lois write that would have made a tremendous difference, I think, in that book.
Well, of course, as the story goes, at any rate, as we read AA history, at any rate, we're told that that Lois wanted to write it and Bill wouldn't, and then of all things, he turned to Dr. Bob's wife, Anne, and asked her to write it, and she refused. And so Lois is not even second best in this story. Bill says, "Okay, then I'll write it." So poor Lois.
I never knew that.
Wow. Yes, that's what historians say that I read, and so that must have been a terrible blow for Lois to take.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt anybody could have written a better chapter than the one on the wives. It's really poorly done, and not even addressing the content, but just the way it's written. It's poor. So yeah, and so we have to accept that our basic text is flawed in some ways.
So so people were making these changes, I guess, in AA World Services. Is that who would actually be doing these changes?
Yes, that would be AAWS would be the one who would make the changes. No one else would make those changes.
And so they would have to be sitting around talking to each other, and talking these changes over, I would think, and they must have a reason for making them, I would think.
Right. You would think
what's so interesting.
If you're changing the first 164 pages of the big book, you would think any change would have a significant reason, or you wouldn't make it. And yet, to look at the changes again, most of them are. I would agree with the anyone who would say, well, come on, maybe it's 400, but that's a lot of punctuation. It is. Mm-hmm. It is, in fact, a lot of punctuations. Mm-hmm. Bill apparently learned to write. When he learned to write, if you had two clauses in a sentence, you separated them with a comma. Well, the nuns who taught me may have lived in a time warp in many ways. I'm sure they did, but they taught me also that anytime there's a clause or two, you separate them with a comma. Then styles in the English language changed, I don't know, decades ago, 30, 40 years ago. And right now we write run-on sentences. We don't use commas nearly as much. If it's a dependent clause in the sentence, then there's the commas are used to separate that. But otherwise, commas, and a lot of these changes are commas. There are some deletions of commas. So what is interesting there is that look at the intent. AAWS was stylistically changing the big book. They were bringing it up to date. And for those who want to change the big book today and bring it more up to date and get rid of the archaic language and et cetera, that has to be an interesting observation that AA not only was willing, but they took on the task themselves of updating the English language in the 164 pages by changing the commas and the semicolons and et cetera, just to bring it more stylistically up to date. So
that's interesting. So that people could understand it better. Although I use a lot of commas when I write. I must have been taught that. But
yeah. Well, and that could be Catholicism in the making. I don't know, but all I know is
comma can change the meaning of a sentence quite a bit.
I'm sorry.
Comma could change the meaning of a sentence quite a bit.
Yes.
How it's read.
Right.
So.
Right.
But yeah, you make a good point. Because for people that want to have, a program of recovery written in language that is easier for people in the 21st century to understand, to be told that the big book can't be changed without a lot of work and effort, and that's just simply not true.
Right. And in fact, the first edition was changed in the second edition, and the second edition was changed in the third edition. And so, in fact, the story of the big book, and I know AA has put out a little booklet, a brief history of the big book. The story that should be told about the brief history of the big book is that it changes in every edition, and that it is an ongoing change. But there were other things. Here's one. This is just interesting to me that in Chapter 7 it says argument and fault finding are to be avoided like leprosy, and that was changed to argument and fault finding are to be avoided like the plague. They're both idiomatic, but for some reason they decided to go with a cliche, which is as idiomatic, but is actually a worse word choice, I would think, because it is a cliche to use plague instead of leprosy. unless they were concerned about insulting alcoholic lepers or something. I don't know.
That was an interesting change. You mentioned what was it? The word alcohol problem drinker and alcoholic. What was that situation, Jerry?
Every time that it said ex-alcoholic, it was changed to ex-problem drinkers.
Now, isn't that interesting?
Yes, in every single case. Now, that's all throughout 11 chapters, it was changed. So now there you can read some intentionality into it, can't you? I mean, you might say that AA decided they don't want to be saying that you're always an alcoholic. That must have been where that concept began to take hold of not saying ex-alcoholic, of always saying that you're always an alcoholic. Somewhere along there, the change. The people who changed it really did have an agenda there.
When I talk to Big Book, I call them Big Book fundamentalists, and most of it isn't really real talking, but it's like exchanges on Facebook and stuff. They make a big deal about being a problem drinker or a real alcoholic. And now here's the Big Book kind of turning the two around.
Right.
I don't know. Right. I mean, people who thump the Big Book, they might be interested in knowing that some of what they are espousing wasn't necessarily the case in previous editions.
Right.
That's interesting.
Right. And it continues to change. And there's in chapter 5 how it works. There's a sentence in the first edition. We were prepared to look at it. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. Mm-hmm. And then in the second edition, it was changed to we were prepared to look for it from an entirely different angle. And then in the third edition, it was changed back to we were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. Well,
that's weird.
From or for whatever. I'm sure I didn't have not looked, but maybe it's been changed again in the fourth edition. I don't know. I don't care whether it has.
One was we're going to look at it from a different angle, and the other one's we're going to look at it for a different angle.
Yeah,
those are kind of different things. We're looking at it from. Okay, if you're looking at it from a different angle, then that means that you're going to take a different perspective. Okay, but if you're looking at it for a different angle, then you're looking for some change in whatever the thing you're looking in. That's how I would read it.
Yeah, right.
It is a little different.
The same kind of thing occurs in chapter 7. There's a sentence that part of which is his own convictions have not worked and yours have. Then in the second edition, his own editions have not worked and I'm sorry. That's not clear. They simply eliminated a comma. His own convictions have not worked, comma, and yours have. So then in the second edition, they take the comma out. In the third edition, they put the comma back in. So yes, it's in flux. It changes in every edition. The spelling of whiskey, I don't know why that should matter so much, but the spelling of whiskey with an E in it or without an E in it is changed in some places in the first 164 pages, and in others it's not. It's left
Was
unchanged.
The old spelling supposed to be without the E?
Depending on whatever the style is at this point. Are we putting whiskey with an E or are we putting it out? In the Big Book, at this point, it's spelled two different ways in the first 164 pages, as it was in the first edition, although some of those were changed, And then there are changes, like in chapter 2, there is a solution. It's talking about alcoholics who have been brought into AA, and a single sentence is, all have recovered. Then in the second edition, nearly all have recovered. Maybe today we would say sometimes some recover occasionally or something. I don't know.
It would be impossible for them all to recover, I think. Well, that is interesting. So they did kind of correct themselves there, and they probably that's a good thing because I don't think that would have been a problem if we all recovered. I guess I don't know.
Right.
Interesting.
Right.
I was going to ask you. You said there was a change made to the 12th step. What was that?
Well, the 12th step, just the spiritual to what was it?
Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs.
Yeah, and the word awakening was experiences, and then it was changed to awakening. The word experiences was changed, and then there were two changes made in the 12th step. There was and I cannot think of it offhand. It's a
they
small
actually changed
change.
the 12th step.
Yeah, this is the 12th step. Yeah, it was changed twice. Just like the third pertinent idea was changed twice. But but the other change was also a removal of not of a comma or anything, but of a word, a small word or something. So so it changes.
In my mind, there's a difference between awakening and experience. And I think even the Big Book, when they came out with that, the third appendix, they were trying to differentiate. They said, okay, when we first wrote this book, the reader might have thought that we all have these sudden revelations. Well, I would think of an awakening as like a sudden revelation, like what Bill had in Towns Hospital, whereas an experience is something that happens more gradually over time. So, okay, so how it's written now, having had a spiritual awakening is how it's written now, but it was experience.
Right.
Now, why
would
they change that? It seems like they're actually changing it the other way. They're actually making it more like to me anyway, an awakening. I guess it doesn't have to be. I guess an awakening can be over a period of time too, but it's just, that is a weird change. I think it's a pretty significant change.
Yes. It was enough to them at any rate to change it.
When was that change made?
Well, we only know that it was made between the 10th printing of the first edition and the 15th printing of the second edition. I don't have access to every printing of every edition, so I can't.
And that second edition, did that come out like in the 50s?
Yes, right.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting.
And then, there are changes in chapter 5 that God could and would if he were sought. Well, it originally was that God could and would if sought, and then he were, and the he were. I have no problem with many of these changes. I think he were helps to clarify that sentence, and so I'm all for it. But,
if he were sought, yeah.
But again, it's not the changes themselves as much as it is the fact that we say we didn't make these changes. So
right.
Yeah.
And because we could make changes if we wanted to. And they're not being honest when they say that they did make changes. Now
well, they're being actually in some cases they just skate pretty close to the truth or to the untruth. But in other cases they lie. I mean, they say clearly, we have not made any changes in that text. I have not had sex with that woman. It's either is or it isn't, and they have in fact made many changes.
So you got this to the General Service Conference.
Yes. Well, actually, what happened, John, is when I saw all of these changes, the first thing I'm thinking is, come on, a little old man in Gilbert, Arizona, is not going to discover something that the world has never known. It doesn't work that way. Everybody must know about this. Others must know about it. I talked to people, and I couldn't find anyone who knew about it. And so on the advice of one of them, I wrote to AAWS. I wrote a letter, and I included the study, which is quite a few pages, showing all of the changes that were made in the 401. And I asked, and I pointed out the places that AA literature says that no changes were made, and including in the preface to the fourth edition. When that came out, actually the fourth edition, when it came out, that's what really stoked it for me, because this was the first time that they were using the Big Book. They had already done it with Experience, Strength, and Hope and Pass It On. They had told flat lies that the text of the Big Book never changed. Didn't happen, no way. But now they were telling that lie in the Big Book. And so that, to me, counted more. And so when the fourth edition came out and they said that no changes have been made, that pissed me off. And so I wrote to AAWS with these 401 changes and said, how can you say what is the reasoning behind it that you make a statement like that when in fact these are the changes that have been made? Why did you change from when you used to have some wiggle room to where you don't right now? And I didn't get an answer to that letter that I sent. And so, I don't know, 5-6 weeks later, I wrote it again. And it was a follow-up, and I wrote it to the Literature Committee and asked, why is it that they are making this statement in the 4th edition that they have not made in the big book before, and it's a falsehood? Why are you saying this? And there was no outrage or anything in the letter. It was simply, it was a question. Why is this happening? Why are you doing this? I would like to understand, not so much why those changes were made, although I am interested in that, but more, why are we saying that they weren't made when they were?
Right. Good point.
And so I kept hammering that point. Well, then I finally called and I spoke to someone who was very, very kind, and she said that yes, she is the one who gets the material that comes to them, and so she would have routed it. And when I explained what the content was, she said, well, I don't know that I remember that particularly, except that I definitely would have routed that to the Literature Committee. So why don't you address your concerns to them? I said, fine, I will. So I wrote a letter to the Literature Committee saying that I have sent several of these packages to them. I have more, and I'm looking for an answer, some sort of response from you, and I didn't get any response at all. So I was left without that avenue of approaching directly AA and having them respond to me. That didn't happen. So yeah, that's when
I know they know how to respond to letters, because when I started my group up, they were very responsive. So evidently someone was reading your letter and didn't want to respond.
In fact, a man who was sort of a mentor to me, who had been in AA for many years and had been office manager for decades, and he just knew AA backward and forward. He knew everything about it, the history. When I told him about writing a letter to AAWS, and I said whether I would get a response, he said, "Oh no, they always respond, Jerry. You will get an answer." I mean, I don't know what they're going to say about this, because this is really something he didn't know about this either. And no one that I spoke to, with people with decades of AA experience, knew anything about these changes. But he said, "Oh no, they will definitely respond." Well, they didn't.
They didn't, and that is funny, because that's how I always think of them, as very responsive. Anytime I've ever, the few occasions I've ever done anything with reaching out to them, they've always been very, very responsive. Right. So yeah, obviously they did not want to respond to your letter.
Right. So yeah, at that point, since I was very active, or had been very active in general service, both as a GSR, DSM, et cetera. So DCM. But I no longer was. In fact, I was very closely working with our intergroup, and I was on the board there and putting my energies there when this all happened. The 4th edition came out, and they made that statement, and so I decided that I would use that. That I know how it works. Any member, and I doubt that there's not a lot of AA members that know this, but anybody can write a motion, basically, to be heard by their state, or however their areas are broken up, to their general service, and request that something be placed, that the in my case, Arizona area would take this information and take it to New York and ask the questions. And so I drafted a suggestion, a change, and I explained in it. It was only a couple of pages. Explained in it what some of the changes and why I was concerned about no changes, and etc. Well, I went to the state function where it was presented, and when it was read, there were, I don't know, there could have been 400, 500 people in that room. they were, again, one amazement that these sorts of changes had been made. And they agreed immediately to take it and take it to New York, make an Arizona motion out of it. Well, once that happens in general service, what happens is it's no longer Jerry Finnegan's. It's now Arizona area who is doing the asking. And so they took it there. And I don't have to rely on hearsay, but I am told by delegates and by people who were there that it was quite a little battle on the floor when it was brought up, because it was no sooner brought up than it was basically dismissed out of hand by AAWS. And
can I ask you a real quick kind of procedural question that I'm just kind of curious about? Okay, I know that, and you're right, that any AA member can present any motion to their area assembly, but can that person also answer questions if people have questions about the motion, just like they would if they were a GSR presenting the motion? At
the state function?
At the assembly, right.
At the assembly, yes. At the assembly, I had written my proposal in such a way that I wrote something, and then I wrote and then I would write a few more sentences, and I would write a few more sentences, and I was writing one really basically long run-on sentences and connecting all of them. And one of the people with Arizona area, just before it was going to be presented, brought it to me, and he asked, can I make this change? And he penciled in, he crossed off the ands and put periods after each. And I said, yes, sure. And so he didn't have me stand up and speak or anything, but he did present it while I was in the room with the changes that he had made. So so then after they approve it, this is when it really becomes a big deal, because it carries more weight having the area behind it, and they're going to take it to the General Service Conference. Exactly. Right.
And you were, and I think I interrupted you, but you said at the General Service Conference there. Go ahead, and were you getting ready to go into that, Jerry, when I interrupted you?
Oh, I was just saying that it wasn't easy, but by this time people had read it, and they had read this. Some had even taken the study behind it. I don't know how many pages it is, 30, 40 pages worth of changes, and looked at them and read them, and they were upset that these changes had been made in some cases, although I wasn't. Again, I tried to distance myself from whether this was a good change or a bad change, and just that it was a change, and you're saying that it hasn't been. So I hewed to that all the way through here. But very definitely when as I'm told, when Arizona area presented it from the floor, it was a very slow build, for one thing. People weren't paying all that much attention. It was dismissed out of hand, and the Arizona area rep delegate went back at it and said, no, I want this, and he pushed it, and then more and more people began to become aware of what he was saying, that the 164 pages have been changed hundreds of times, and they were amazed, as most people are when they hear this. And so then they began to get behind the motion that AAWS ought to hear this. And unfortunately, when I wrote it, and the way Arizona area presented it, I said that AA is saying in the 4th edition of the Big Book that no changes have been made in the first 164 pages. And I wrote that in Pass It On, the story of Bill Wilson and how the AA message reaches the world, they did the same. And in other AA material too, they had said that no changes have been made. So I wanted all of those addressed. Every time that we said that no changes have been made, I wanted that to be corrected. And I understandably, since it became a very heated discussion, the focus began to be the Big Book and the Big Book only. And then when it passed, which is to say AAWS was forced to make a change, it was only the Big Book that they that had any attention paid to it.
So I'm going to ask you some questions because I just don't know. I know what the General Service Office is. I know what the General Service Conference is. AA World Services, that's just the publishing arm. Is that right? They do the publishing part?
Yeah, I think they do a little more than publishing, but okay. No doubt publishing is the largest part of what they do. Yes.
Okay, but they're run by GSO?
Exactly. I mean, the GSO is the overriding entity. Sure.
Okay, yeah. But the assembly, which is actually, because we're upside down triangle, I'm not the assembly, but the General Service Conference, which is composed of all these area delegates, they are the ones that can tell General Service Conference what to do. So they can tell the GSO, okay, you've got to do this, and GSO must do that.
Yes, and that has happened more than a dozen times. And certainly this was one time, but it's happened fairly often through our history that the delegates from the floor have been on one side of an issue, and the GSO has been on the other side. And in all cases, it's simply a matter the delegates win if it comes down to a disagreement. Yeah.
That's interesting. They can actually tell the General Service Office, because see, I have a little motion pending before my area assembly, which is kind of I'll tell you what it is. Basically, it says that when the General Service Office shares its experience with central offices and intergroups about whether or not to list an agnostic group in the meeting directory, the GSO should always be very clear and unambiguous in sharing that the experience is, yes, we list them. And so I said, I want the General Service Conference to direct GSO to provide this experience when they get calls from central offices, because I know they get them from time to time. And what I was kind of thinking of was that lawsuit in Toronto. I was thinking that, boy, GSO kind of, they could have been more direct, in letting the Toronto guys know. Anyway, so my delegate says, oh, we can't tell GSO what to do, but they can, can't they?
Oh.
Or is that something different?
Oh, no, I would differ greatly there. Yes, in fact, the delegates, that's what they're there for. And the service manual is quite clear about that. They have the responsibility to make changes and to tell. They are the ones, they are actually the deliberative body. They are the ones who get to tell everybody in New York exactly what to do when they decide what they want done. Yes, I would disagree with your delegate on that.
I think so too. And so far, what I've seen, and I haven't been in service for that long, but I see the upside down triangle working pretty good because I, as just a one single GSR representing my group, can take something to the assembly, and even if I'm in the minority, I get to be heard. Often, however many times the minority opinion has to be heard, but it's really given very serious consideration. And then once it gets to the assembly, they're the ones that, then they have to get with all their delegates though, but then they do run to kind of get things changed. I mean, I do think it's possible to get change done in AA, and I don't think it has to take forever.
Right. I agree. Once the delegates get behind it, it'll get done. Yes.
Yep.
I actually received one phone call as a result of all of this when the changes were made, because now it was an Arizona area and no one necessarily knew who I was. But a delegate, or he may have been an alternate delegate. But anyway, I know he was from New Jersey, and he called me here at my house, and he asked me if I was the one who had written all of that. And I was surprised because, of course, my name no longer appeared anywhere, but he'd somehow found it out. And we talked about it for a while, and he wanted to know more about the changes and whether I had made any other, because I kept the first 164 pages. So the question there is, well, what about the rest of it? What about the prefaces to the big book and to the doctor's opinion and all those other areas? Were there changes made there? And in fact, there were. In every edition, I'd like to just kind of emphasize that in every edition, the doctor's opinion has changed. The doctor may be changing his opinions even now as we speak, because it changes quite a bit. And of all odd things, the foreword to the first edition. It's already right. It's printed. It's right there in the first edition, the forward. So in the second edition, the forward to the first edition is printed in the second edition, except that it's not. There are 6 or 7 changes made to the forward to the first edition when it appears in the second edition. Moreover, there are 5 or 6 changes made to the preface to the second edition when it appears in the third edition. So they keep giving us this look back at what the prefaces were on the earlier editions, except they changed them significantly. And here we're not talking commas. Here we're talking language and meaning. I think that changes more in the forwards and in the doctor's opinion than it does in the actual 164 pages. So.
Do you remember what kind of changes they made to the doctor's opinion?
No, I don't really remember that right off.
The only reason I ask is that's the one chapter I probably read more than any other, because I had a sponsor that he said I had to read something every day for 30 days, believe it or not, and if I missed a day, I had to start all over again. Well, I actually did that with the doctor's opinion. I don't know how many damn times I read it, but I read it a lot. So. Yeah, it is actually a pretty good chapter, I think, or good little write-up.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. In fact, in sponsoring, I tell people, yes, by all means, read the forwards and read the 164 pages. But when you're done, go back and reread the doctor's opinion, because I just think that it's much more meaningful after you wade through those 11 chapters. The doctor's opinion, it will be much clearer what that man was trying to get to when he wrote what he did.
Yeah, there is something to that. Yeah, I still like the doctor's opinion, though I think it wouldn't hurt to have an updated opinion, have a more, maybe another doctor also opine.
Right.
But that's for another day, I guess.
Yes. Although the people, again, who are interested in changing the big book, they have an opening here. They can talk about continuing changes and more changes and more updating than we've been doing, etc. So it's the slippery slope is long slipped. So they just need to grab onto that and take.
I find it really interesting. They actually changed something in the 12 steps themselves. It's probably not a big deal whether you call it an awakening or experience, but maybe awakening actually sounds better when you read it. I don't know, but it's interesting because they make a big deal about changing the steps, whether you can or you can't. Yes,
and again, what was also interesting as far as changes go is, and again, this may just seem like a very minor change, but they're in the book, big book, and it talks about in the 164 pages, it talks about on chapter 7 the 12 steps of the program of recovery. Well, the program recovery is capitalized. So we're really clearly talking about the program of recovery. And of course, the 12 steps are the program of recovery. So what did they do? In the second edition, they put program, they put the program recovery in lowercase, de-emphasizing the program of recovery. And you just scratch your head and say, why the hell would you do that? Why would you de-emphasize the program of recovery? So
do you think after that motion, do you think that, or maybe you even know, have they made any changes since that time?
Well, of course, they made the one change in which they did take out, or they did put the word in largely when they're in the preface to the 4th edition. They changed that. So that gave them the wiggle room. What they did as a result of my sending that in, the response that they actually made was to insert the word largely, that the changes have been that the first 164 pages have been largely unchanged. Yes. Yeah. So they changed the preface in that area. And
so do you think that they can't, are they not allowed really? Okay, I know that they have changed the big book, but do you think now if they wanted to change the big book that they would be more careful if they wanted to make changes like that?
I would hope that they would know that people are watching, that people are reading the big book so closely that if they make changes like that, that people are going to know about it. And so don't go saying things. But unfortunately, we still have there's no other word for it, what are lies within our literature, because experience, strength, and hope still says that no changes have been made, and pass it on, no change, still says that no changes have been made. Unchanged is the word they use. Unchanged is the original text of the first 11 chapters. Well, it's not unchanged. It's remarkably changed, and so we're still up to that, and we're not. The AAWS is not willing to take the high road and write the brief history of the big book and say, yes, many changes have been made, especially in punctuation and grammar, stylistic changes, etc. And, just take the high road and say, yes, it has happened. However, now at this point, the sentiment is such that we would not make any changes to the first 100.
Exactly.
Here's John. Phyllis from the general manager of GSO.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So she spoke at Santa Monica.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I didn't catch her at Santa Monica because I've seen her speak twice, and she has a good story and she delivers it very well. But the two times I'd heard it, they were identical, and so I didn't care to hear it for a third time. But here's a little story of what happened. I was at PRASA, and Phyllis spoke. And she spoke for an hour, and then they said, we're going to take a break, an hour, lunch or dinner break, I don't know. At any rate, it was a meal break. And then we're going to come back, and Phyllis is going to spend, I think, 20 minutes on Q&A. So we have a basket up here, and here are some paper. They were like a quarter of an A4 page. And slip, fill out a question if you have one for Phyllis, and she'll pick it out. And so I grabbed a handful of those and went out in the lobby, and I wrote that what I wrote was, why is it that AAWS claims that no changes have been made to the first 164 pages when, in fact, 400 changes were made to the first edition and 7 changes were made to the foreword of the first edition as it appears in the second edition, and 8 changes were made to the foreword to the second edition as it appears in the fourth edition, and 6 changes were made to the doctor's opinion of the first edition as it appears in the second edition. That's what I wrote. I still have a slip, so I know exactly what I wrote. Well, at the end of an hour, my hand was cramped, and I took all these and put them up in the basket. And Phyllis called a couple of names, or a couple of questions rather, and then she had mine. She started reading it, and when she did, her speech started to slow also became lower. But at a PRASA, there's almost 2,000 people, and these guys and gals were talking amongst themselves, and they were definitely drowning her out with their crosstalk among themselves. And she did, when she finished up, she said something like, I don't know if this is a speech or a question or something like that, because it was a long question. So I give her credit to that. She got a little laughter out of that. But she said, well, yes, of course, changes have been made in time, some changes here and there, but essentially nothing much has been changed. And she let it go at that and drew the next one. Well, I found that interesting because they had said when she was going to draw the slips that this was God's will, whichever slip got chosen. And I thought Jerry's will had a part in there too. So I went out in the hallway when Phyllis was leaving, and there was a little queue had been forming. There's like 3 or 4 people in front of me and 3 or 4 behind me, and in the hallway to talk to Phyllis. And so when my turn came up, I said, yeah, Phyllis, I enjoyed very much what you had to say. I'm the guy who wrote that long question about the changes that have been made to the big book. And she stiffened, and she blanched, and she interrupted me. That's as far as I got. She said, I want you to know that Bill approved every one of those changes. Okay. And I said, really? No, I did not know that. Thank you for telling me that. Now, I got to interrupt, John, and say, I like to think I'm a better person today than I was 12 years ago, but I wouldn't say something snarky now today. But then what happened. She told me that Bill had approved all these changes, and I said, really? No, I think that's interesting that he approved all of those changes that we in fact know were not made. And she kind of turned colors on that and pushed past me and walked out. And so that was the end of that.
I was kind of wondering about that of Bill W., because a lot of those changes were made while he was still alive, but not all of them were. Some of those were made, I think you said, in the 4th edition, weren't they?
Oh yes, the third. There's changes in the third from the second and fourth. But so that tell you, like we were speaking earlier about how these changes, how this went about. Was there a committee? When she told me that Bill knew about all of those changes, let's accept that as true, true statement. I have no reason to doubt her. Well, that means that back at the ranch, back in New York, they know the story of what happened about these changes and why they were made, and they know the real history of the big book back there. They know, and they know what the arguments must have been about why change this or why not change that. I wonder what else was going to be changed but didn't pass.
That is interesting. And plus, someone had to prime her. Someone had to tell her about all. She wouldn't have known that Bill approved any of that stuff. Someone had to tell her that all that happened.
Right. So there's a whole
didn't happen on her watch.
A fascinating story back there in New York that we don't know.
It is really interesting.
Yeah, I'd very much like to know what the thought was behind it, even when they grabbed it first initially and began to decide that it needed to be changed. Yeah. I wonder if they hesitated.
Things like the government sometimes it might be like one of those things like the government says it's always the cover up that's worse than the actual action.
Yeah, exactly right. The changes themselves, by and large, are not all that significant. But the fact that we continue to say that we never made any changes is significant. And why deny them? I mean, the more insignificant they are, the more you have to wonder why deny that you made such an insignificant change. I don't know. That's a mystery to me. But there are people who know the answer to that. So.
There are people that know the answer to that. Yeah. Well, I do know that the Big Book is pretty revered. I mean, I respect the Big Book as a historical document, and even as it even plays a role in my recovery. And I think everybody should read it. But some people take their worship of the Big Book to extremes, and maybe they know that up in at GSO that there are people that really might be upset if they thought people were tampering with the Big Book. Right.
And since then, the manuscript has come out, the multilith version, and we're able to compare that. Well, we're able to compare the multilith with the manuscript with the first edition, the first printing of the first edition, and that's fascinating to see the changes. Since I really think that Ruth. I mean, in that publishing room at the time, that printer's room, we're told Hank was there and Ruth and Bill. That's it. Now, Jimmy Burwell had a lot to do with the secularity, the little secularity that does exist within the Big Book. But Hank, Bill and Lois were living with Hank. They owed their housing to him, and he hired Bill when they started the business, and so. Bill was answerable to Hank in a lot of ways, and Hank's influence over Bill, I suspect, was larger than Jimmy Burwell's. Jimmy was perhaps more loud about it, but Hank was an atheist, and he was always an atheist, and his influence over Bill, when the three of them were standing, I'd like to see, that's a great little play that could be written. The three of them are standing there with the galleys, and they're looking at the proofs, and they're taking pencils, and they're changing this. And then you can see when the changes were made, how a change was scratched out and another one written in over that. We can see that today looking at that material. But we don't know whether it was Ruth or Hank or Bill that made the change and then changed the change. But it's a fascinating, I would just, I just think of that, hour or two they spent changing the galley. And what that must have been like.
I want to buy that. I've got that what's it called? It's not a manuscript, but what was it called? You used the word, and I can't remember what it was. But anyway, the original manuscript. The multi-lith. The multi-lith, right. So I've seen that book. I've got it on Kindle, but I really need to get the real hardcover book so I could really take advantage of looking at it. It's a pretty expensive book, but they sell it at our central office. I want to get that. But was the multi-lith what they actually used? So they took that, they crossed all the stuff out, and then the final document, is that what they used to print from?
They print from the galley. I mean, once they have the printer's dummy, the galley proof has been signed off on. And by the way, I don't know how they got away with making all those changes in the margin, just dozens and dozens and dozens of changes. You couldn't do that with the printer today. They would not allow you to just stand there and make all those changes after they'd already set type. No, they wouldn't do it. You would not.
I guess I misunderstood that thing. I thought that all those changes that in that multi-lith or whatever, I thought that those were like when they were debating the big book, that they were all agreed upon changes. But
right. Well, okay. So, and I think that, and this is just an opinion, but I think this business that hundreds of people were involved in writing really the first 164 pages, I don't think, and sometimes changes were made in Ohio. Akron would make this for these 5 or 6 changes, and we know for a fact Bill would look at them and throw 3 or 4 of them out. I mean, Bill had his way in the end. That was Bill, and he had a strong character, and so the multi-lith, and it's sometimes called the lithograph, but it's not. Okay. Lithography is a different process totally from multi-lith. The multi-lith is the one that they sent out to all the doctors' offices and clergy and people who they thought might be interested. Many changes were made to that, but many of those changes were made right in the printer's room. So that's to me fascinating. I just envision those 3 people standing there and making those changes.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Boy, that Ruth knew a lot. That's very interesting. She Thomas knew her. Ruth Hawk, that Bill's secretary?
Ruth Hawk, I didn't know that Thomas knew her. No,
he knew her. Yeah, and he tells a story which I think is kind of interesting, that in Bill's last days, he and Ruth were working on a project to write a secular version of the Big Book. And
I've never heard that.
Yes. He says that in her apartment there were all these boxes of material that she and Bill were working on to put this new book together, but that after Bill died, they all somehow mysteriously disappeared and vanished, and he's always been trying to figure out what happened to them, and he's not getting anywhere. He's gone to stepping stones. He's done all kinds of legwork trying to figure out what happened with that. Because I guess Ruth was really into the Stoicism, and it kind of made sense that she would probably help Bill with this. I don't know. Maybe she helped Bill with everything, but I don't know. You might want to talk to Thomas about that sometime. But he mentioned it on a previous podcast that we did.
What a holy grail of AA secularity that would be, huh?
And he heard it from Ruth. Ruth told him that.
Oh, doggone! Wow.
And he says the problem with
Ruth
it
actually,
is it's all
of course,
hearsay.
and Ruth really, since she was writing, she was responsible for spelling whiskey the way it was in one place, and maybe spelling it and in the commas, and so not that there's any fault finding. I have no fault to find on any of that. It's just that it was Ruth. I doubt that Bill was dictating punctuation when he spoke. Right. Maybe he was. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, very interesting. Very interesting. So you're going to do this will be an interesting discussion that you'll have at the conference or convention in Austin.
Yes, and we'll have another opportunity to expose more AAs to the fact that we are in a constant flux with the first 164 pages, and I have no problem with that. I just have a problem with saying that we're not in a constant flux.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, I really enjoyed this very much. Thank you for doing this and letting me know about all of this. I've learned a lot. It's very interesting. I love AA history. A lot of people like AA history on AA Beyond Belief. Those AA history articles that Bob writes are always some of the more popular articles that we put out there. So it's interesting stuff.
Right.
Very interesting stuff.
One of these days, I'll try to get to the German Big Book and the Mexican Big Book, and those are fascinating stories in themselves. But
absolutely, and I remember finding something about that online. That some guy, I think in Germany, he was like printing copies of the Big Book and giving them out to people for free. Right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, that's there's a lot more to it. It has to do with copyrights, and it's. Actually, there's German copyrights and American copyrights, and our that is to say, AA's losing the copyright on the first edition and on the second edition, and yes, but what they did basically is they printed a lot of they only printed the first 164 pages, but they printed those in a small pocket book and gave them away, and meanwhile, AA was getting almost $50 a copy for the Big Book, and so they had a significant loss of money in Germany when these people began to give out actually thousands of these big books, and they would not take any money for them. Yeah, it's an interesting story.
They sued him. We'll go into that sometime. One of these, we definitely have to talk about that one of these days. Right. That is very interesting because people would be surprised that AA would go after one of its own like that. That poor guy, they really went after him, if I remember, if what I read was true. Yeah. It's something I just happened to find on the internet.
Yes.
But I never knew about the Mexico thing. I don't know about that.
Yeah. Well, it's not as in the German thing, the Mitchell K. Called the day that we took that printer to court. He called it the saddest day in AA history. Mm-hmm. And so, that's no question. The German Big Book fiasco is more shameful. Mm-hmm. All we did was money grub in Mexico and try to get more money than it was worth, and sue people for that, sue AA members to get more money. But in Mexico, we really trashed a man and had him facing a prison sentence, and we broke we AA broke the anonymity of a number of AA members in Germany, and that's shameful. Yep. So
that is that. Well, that's definitely something we want to talk about one of these days.
Right.
Well, I could probably go on forever, Jerry, but we probably should wind it down. Yeah. But thank you very much for this. Thank you. I appreciate it. Very interesting stuff.
Okay, John.
Again, we'll go over the Mexican and German thing next time.
Right. Okay. Take care, John.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Well, that's it for another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the program. We'll be back real soon. And until then, take care and be well.